Welcome back to Lend Me Your Ears, and this is Chapter 8. Although Alvarado was lost in this enterprise, the voyage to Cibola was not abandoned, for Francisco Velasquez marched there with 800 men, most of whom were horsemen. However, they found nothing but snowy mountains and barren plains, to the extent that his men and horses starved due to lack of provisions. Therefore, he returned without success to Mexico, having only burned some villages and had several encounters with the natives. But Atahualpa, a Peruvian prince, was informed of Pizarro and Almagro's arrival and ordered them to leave his kingdom. However, they disregarded his command and marched directly to Cajamarca, where Atahualpa held his court. Atahualpa sent other messengers to them, commanding them to leave his territory. Pizarro replied that he could only obey the commands of his master, the emperor, who had ordered him to speak with the king himself at his palace. Hearing that Pizarro intended to proceed, Atahualpa sent him a pair of painted shoes and armlets to wear when appearing before his throne. Captain Ferdinand Soto led 20 horsemen and passed close to the flank of Atahualpa's army. The Indians, amazed by the horses, retreated into their fortifications, but were immediately killed by the king's order for their cowardice. Soto sent a message to Atahualpa, expressing the Spaniards' desire to negotiate peace. Atahualpa replied that no peace could be made unless the Spaniards returned the gold and silver they had plundered and left his territories. If they did so, they would have an audience the next day. Upon receiving this message, Bishop Vincent de Villaveridi was escorted to the royal palace in Cajamarca, where he was brought before Atahualpa. Atahualpa arrived at the palace in great splendor, carried on the shoulders of his noblemen in a sedan. Garlands of gold and various colored feathers adorned the sedan, while Atahualpa himself wore a white, sleeveless robe. A red ribbon with a long tassel adorned his temples, and 3 exquisite feathers adorned his forehead. 300 members of his personal guard marched before him, dressed in the same livery, clearing the way for the king. The bishop carried a cross in one hand and a book in the other, engaged in a conversation with the king. He explained that God is a trinity. Adam was the first man, Christ was born of a virgin and died on the cross, and the Pope, as God's representative, had given Peru and all other American countries to Emperor Charles. The bishop warned that if Atahualpa resisted, he would face utter ruin. Atahualpa responded that he served Pachamama, the creator of all things, and revered the sun and moon. He questioned the glory of a crucified God compared to the radiant sun and moon. Atahualpa believed that wise governance involved making peace and alliances with powerful rulers. He criticized the Pope for giving away kingdoms that were not his to give and expressed his unwillingness to abandon his ancestral religion due to a lack of apparent evidence for Christianity's truth. The bishop tried to convince Atahualpa by presenting the book as evidence, but Atahualpa examined it, turned its pages, looked closely at the print, and eventually threw it away disdainfully, finding it unsatisfactory. While the king and the bishop were engaged in their discussion, Pizarro seized the opportunity to organize his men into battle formation. He divided his 60 horsemen into 3 wings. Led by his 3 brothers, Ferdinand, John, and Gonzalvo Pizarro, Captains Soto and Benalcazar were left in ambush, while Pedro de Candia led the vanguard and Pizarro himself commanded the main body. Soto remained in the rear. As the bishop informed them of Atahualpa's contemptuous response, Pizarro's forces were prepared for battle, had thrown his holy book, the Word of God, onto the ground. Both armies engaged while their trumpets sounded, drums beat, cannons roared, horses neighed, and dogs barked. They swiftly marched towards the walls of Cajamarca, and the terrifying cacophony of noises struck panic in the hearts of the Indians. They fled in a chaotic stampede, trampling each other to death at the city gates. As the gates were too narrow to accommodate them, they even broke through their own walls to enter. The Spaniards took advantage of this opportunity and entered with them, shooting and killing as many as they could reach. The dogs also contributed to the slaughter. Groups of Indians were trampled under the horses' hooves, but the resistance was greatest near Atahualpa's chair. Whenever one bearer fell, another immediately took his place. The king was surrounded by heaps of his own slain subjects, Pizarro himself. Charged so close that he seized Atahualpa by his long hair, pulled him out of his throne, and swiftly secured him in chains. At that moment, all of Atahualpa's life guards abandoned him and fled. The blame for the loss of the battle, which led to Atahualpa's complete ruin, was attributed to Raninagui, a captain who was supposed to ambush the Spaniards with 5,000 men from the rear. However, Raninagui was so terrified by the unfamiliar noise of the guns and the rest that he fled southward for 150 leagues without looking back. Meanwhile, Atahualpa negotiated his ransom with Pizarro. He agreed to pay Pizarro as much gold as the hall in his court, where they made the agreement, could hold up to the top. They measured the height and length of the hall, which turned out to be 54 feet long and 9 feet wide. In accordance with this agreement, gold was brought from various places as ordered by Atahualpa. However, he could not gather enough gold to fulfill the deal, which caused the Spaniards to complain. Atahualpa requested more time to fulfill his part of the bargain, explaining to Pizarro that most of the gold was brought on slaves' shoulders, a long and troublesome journey of 200 leagues from the city of Cusco. If this did not satisfy Pizarro, he could send some of his own people there to inform him that he need not fear any danger, as long as Atahualpa was a prisoner with his wife and children. The two captains, Soto and Peter del Barro, were sent on that mission, and after several days' journey, they encountered one of Atahualpa's leaders who was bringing the king's brother Guasca as a prisoner to Cajamarca. Guasca now had a chance to seek assistance from the Spaniards, informed them that he and Atahualpa were the sons of Guaynacaba and that the kingdom was supposed to be divided between them. However, Atahualpa had forcibly taken control of the entire kingdom, even though he, being the youngest, should have been satisfied with the portion that Guasca, as the eldest, would have assigned to him. He pleaded for Pizarro to deliver him from his brother's bloody hands, promising to provide 3 times as much gold as Atahualpa had promised. He asked Soto and Barro to delay their journey to Cusco, but they did not dare to do so and continued on their way. Guasca, descending the Susuanan Valley, was burned alive by Atahualpa's soldiers. Meanwhile, Almagro arrived with fresh forces in Cajamarca, causing trouble for Pizarro, who was solely focused on obtaining gold. On the other hand, Almagro, equally greedy, grew suspicious that Pizarro intended to keep the promised haul full of gold for himself, denying Almagro his share because Atahualpa was Pizarro's prisoner. Almagro eagerly desired for Atahualpa to be secretly disposed of and for the booty to be divided between them. To prevent any potential disagreements, Pizarro gave each private soldier 1,000 ducats in gold and 6,525 silver crowns in the presence of the king. The lower-ranking officers received 34,000 crowns, while the others received 60,000. Pizarro reserved 1/5 of the booty for the emperor. Despite Atahualpa fulfilling his promise by filling the hall with gold, he was sentenced to death. His pleas of innocence and requests to be sent to Spain to clear his name before the emperor were disregarded. He sighed and lamented his misfortunes as he was tied to a post and strangled in Pizarro's presence. Divine vengeance pursued these cruel and unjust arbitrators, as none of them died at natural death. Furthermore, it was noted that a few days before Atahualpa's execution, a comet appeared. Upon seeing it, Atahualpa sadly predicted that a great prince would die soon. Pizarro's main justification for the king's execution was that he had cruelly murdered his brother, Guasca. However, this was merely a pretext, as what angered them against Atahualpa was his refusal to reveal the location of the invaluable treasure that Guasca had buried. Before his death, Atahualpa expressed his desire to be buried in the territory of Quito next to his father, Guaynacaba. The Peruvians believed that Guaynacaba, known for his great justice and wise governance, would rise again and bring peace and order to the troubled world. Atahualpa's remains were accordingly buried there, carried thither in great state after their manner, attended by his brother Illescas Raninagui, who ran from Atahualpa in the battle, where he lay in ambush when he could have done them good service. On the way to his entertainment, he received them with all shows of sorrow, but when they were feasting excessively, buried in sleep and wine, he massacred and flayed Illescas, the king's brother, alive and made a tabor of his skin. While Atahualpa's funeral was thus bloodily solemnized, his general Quizquiz raised a great army, which Pizarro, encountering after a valiant resistance, totally routed. Then, marching victoriously to Cusco, he saw great fires in the city and the citizens fighting with the Spaniards sent before. But with the horse breaking in upon them, most of them fled to the mountains the next morning. Thus the Spaniards became masters of the city, where they inflicted the most cruel tortures on all sexes to force them to reveal if they knew of any hidden treasures. They were not satisfied with what they found there, although they had obtained a greater treasure in Cusco than what they had extorted from Atahualpa before. They even fed those who were murdered to their dogs. Among the rest, Didacus Salazar, who had a very fierce dog called Becerril, also had an old Indian woman as his prisoner. He gave her a letter to deliver to General Pizarro. The woman had not gone many paces before she was set upon by Becerril, whom Salazar let loose to delight himself in seeing the dog tear the poor old woman apart. But she, observing him coming running at her with such great fierceness, fell down onto her knees and held forth the letter, crying, good my lord, dog, I must carry this letter to General Pizarro." Upon this, the furious cur, having more compassion than the Spaniard, stood still for a moment and eventually lifted up his leg in a scornful manner, urinated on her, and returned satisfied. Salazar, pleased with the playful behavior of the dog and the old woman, laughed and spared her life. After Cusco had been sufficiently plundered, Pizarro appointed Almagro as its governor along with the territories belonging to it, and built a town near the river Lima called Los Reyes. Meanwhile, Almagro received letters patent from the emperor appointing him Marshal of Peru. Encouraged by this honor, he embarked on a great expedition, as the Peruvians had reported that the golden Chile lay to the south. Assisted by Pizarro, Almagro marched in search of it with 2 troops of horses and 500-foot soldiers. However, heavy rains and foul weather made the journey almost impassable, causing great trouble for the expedition. Nevertheless, they pressed on, but suffered losses of both horses and men. While Almagro was on this undertaking, Francisco Pizarro received letters patent from the emperor, declaring him the Duke of Peru with a caveat regarding the previous honor bestowed on Almagro. However, these balanced honors created great discord between the Duke and the Marshal, as Mangoinga, another of Atahualpa's brothers, observed. He seized the opportunity and attacked the Spanish garrison in Cusco, capturing the city. In response, Pizarro immediately sent his horsemen under the command of Alfonso Alvarado and Gomez de Todia, against whom the Indians fought valiantly. The battle was long and uncertain, but eventually the Spaniards achieved a bloody victory and regained Cusco. Almagro, returning after some time with little success and having accomplished nothing, was kept out by Ferdinand Pizarro under the pretext that he could not open the gate without order from his brother, the Duke. Almagro, much offended by this, yet saying little, was secretly let into the city, where he surprised Governor Ferdinand Pizarro and his brother Gonsalvo, along with Alfonso Alvarado, who were taken as prisoners. Almagro swore that he would not rest until he had rooted out all the Pizarros from Peru. However, while he was about to pass the sentence of death on them, Gonsalvo and Alvarado escaped from prison and fled to the Duke. Troubled for his brother Ferdinand, who was in custody and in danger of his life, the Duke came to a compromise and Ferdinand was also released. But as soon as this was done and he had secured the safety of his brother, the Duke had no intention of keeping the newly established peace. He sent a message to Almagro, stating that since the emperor had given him supreme command over Peru, he demanded that Almagro leave Cusco, or else he would be forced out. Almagro responded that he would obey only if he could see the emperor's hand, otherwise he would not. Consequently, both parties prepared for war and had several intense skirmishes in a short period of time. However, Almagro, being too weak, fell into the Duke's hands. The Duke ordered him to be strangled in prison and later publicly beheaded in the marketplace. Ferdinand Pizarro, shortly after, was sent to Spain with a portion of the acquired treasure for the emperor. He was imprisoned in the castle Motto for Almagro's death. However, what further transpired during his imprisonment or what became of him has never been recorded in any written account. Young Almagro, driven by the instigation of his guardian John Rada, resolved to seek revenge for his father's death. To that end, he went to Los Reyes and, with the help of some hired dissidents, planned to murder the Duke during high service on St. John's Day in the church. Although the plot was not kept completely secret, the Duke received a hint of it and decided to stay at home and not attend Mass that day. The conspirators, fearing that their plan had been discovered, although foiled in their intent, were not deterred and showed great courage. They stormed to the palace at noon, crying, "Kill the tyrant! Kill the traitor!" However, Pizarro had already locked the gates and armed himself. Unable to enter, they retreated through the city, waving a bloodied sword and proclaiming that Pizarro had been slain. This news was believed, and over 200 private friends of Almagro emerged. They all rushed to the palace, gathering around the gates. Francisco de Chores, who came out through a secret door in an attempt to pacify the mutineers, was immediately stabbed. They continued their advance along the path he had taken, encountering resistance. 7 halberdiers of Pizarro's guard fought bravely until they were all killed in the presence of the Duke. Pizarro was captured alive and brought before Almagro, who savagely butchered him with his own hands. Afterward, they ran through the streets shouting, "Long live the Emperor and Didacus Almagro!" However, despite all this, Pizarro's party joined together and valiantly resisted the conspirators, resulting in a significant number of casualties on both sides. Nevertheless, Almagro eventually gained the upper hand and confiscated the goods of all those who were against him. From that point on, everyone treated him as the chief governor until the emperor either confirmed his position or appointed someone else. Moving on to Cusco, Almagro nearly paid a heavy price, but was saved by receiving private intelligence in advance. The situation unfolded as follows. Garcias Alvarado and Christopher Sotelo served as joint governors of Cusco. However, they quarreled and engaged in a physical altercation, which resulted in Sotelo's death. Almagro took very heinously, as being his intimate friend, giving forth threatening speeches of revenge, which Alvarado informed him of, and intending some way or other to prevent all dangers and save himself, he invited Almagro to a feast, but privately resolving to make it a bloody banquet by his death at the table. Of this, he, being informed, as we mentioned before, stayed at home, and privately sent for some soldiers that had belonged to Sotelo, sending word that he was indisposed. Alvarado, under a show of kindness, goes to Almagro, hoping to persuade him to come to his prepared treat, but as soon as he was entered the hall, they clapped to the gate, and the soldiers, falling upon Alvarado, slew him. But soon after, Almagro was called in question, and not long after he enjoyed his usurped authority, for the Emperor Charles, sending the learned Vaca de Castro with full authority to Peru to settle that disturbed kingdom. Almagro, who now used to govern, had no ears to become a subject. Therefore he marched with an army to meet Castro, by whom, after a bloody fight, being beaten and put to flight, having 4,000 men, he fell into the victor's hands near Cusco, where he was treated very severely, for shortly after he was condemned to be beheaded, others were strangled, and some were torn in pieces with horses. Not long after this great execution, Blasco Núñez Vela came to Peru, and, being appointed viceroy, had 4 counselors assigned to him, with whom he was to consult in all affairs, and especially to set the Indians at liberty who till then had suffered much misery under the Spanish tyranny. To perform this, the emperor had given an order under his great seal, which was to be published and proclaimed in all places. Vela, at his arrival, faithfully performed all his commands, seized upon Vaca de Castro because he had executed Almagro without any examination or trial. Yet by this means he got the hatred of all, so that most of the Spaniards chose Gonsalvo Pizarro for their chief, whereby affairs grew daily more and more out of order. Núñez Vela laid all the blame thereof upon William X. Juarez, governor of Lima, whom he sent for in the night, and correcting him over severely, gave him also 2 mortal wounds, of which he presently died. The body was in the morning drawn along the streets, which caused so much murmuring among the inhabitants that soon after they seemed to make a general insurrection. Therefore Núñez Vela, fearing the worst, resolved to convey himself from thence incognito and pass to Trujillo. But his 4 counselors advised him to the contrary. Yet he took his own way, causing all his treasure to be sent aboard, and having made ready his horses to depart, the common people in a tumultuous manner set upon the palace, catching, snatching up, and carrying away all the silver they could find, and meeting the viceroy, seized and thrust him into a dungeon. Whichever they did, they fell at variance amongst themselves, for some would have him executed, but others insisted on having him sent prisoner to Spain. The latter, being the more moderate, getting the upper hand, Vela was put aboard and committed to the custody of Didacus Alvarez, who, anchoring in the mouth of the river Tumbes, kindness growing between them, released the viceroy his prisoner, and set him ashore, who not long after got some force together. Meanwhile, Pizarro was everywhere acknowledged as the supreme governor, who, having intelligence of the viceroy's design, sent Francisco Carvajales thither, between whom and Vela was a sharp encounter, but at last, being worsted and retaken by Carvajales, he was soon after executed, and his head was placed on a pole near the gallows. The Emperor Charles, turmoiled with wars at home, saw no likelihood to settle the confused affairs of Peru. Yet at last he thought it convenient to send one Peter Gasca thither, an ecclesiastic of a subtle and ingenious wit, who, landing in Lima in 1546 with no other title than chief councillor, to the emperor took quite another course than Vela, persuading them all that affairs should be settled in order, according to their own desires, and former miscarriages never be remembered, being utterly deleted by an act of oblivion. The news of this general pardon spreading itself far and near wrought a great change, for Pizarro's intimates and those nearest of concern shrank daily from him, which Gasca, observing, marched against him, and that they might make more haste, they loaded several Peruvians, chained with their arms, whom, when they lagged, they switched and whipped before them. And now, both armies being met and discharging their cannons at one another, with considerable loss to each side, whole regiments came running over to Gasca, so that Pizarro, being quite forsaken, yielded himself to the mercy of the conqueror, who accused him of high treason and caused him to be strangled in a dungeon, and fixed his head on a marble pillar in Lima, surrounded with iron rails, and inscribed with a brief account of all his offences. Gasca, not thus satisfied, hanged up several commanders, and whipping and stigmatizing others, condemned them afterward to the galleys. But his greatest spite was against the Field Marshal Carvajales, a person of the age of 80 years, whom, tying to a horse's tail, he caused a whole hour to be drawn up and down the marketplace, scorned and derided by all people, which done, he was quartered alive. Not long after, Gasca surrendered the command of Peru to the learned Cuenca, and carried an invaluable treasure to Germany for the Emperor Charles, who gave him in requital for his faithful service the bishopric of Valencia. About the same time that Gasca arrived in Spain, John Stade had the command over a small fort raised of stone and earth on the island Morro, adjacent to Brazil, because the savage people of Tupan Imba sailed twice a year from the country of Briquioca to Morro at the time when the plant abatai was ripe, of which they made the liquor that they generally drink at their human banquets. They also landed on Morro for the bratti fishing. This bratti is a fish of a very delicious taste, either caught in nets or shot by the Tupan Imba and carried to their several habitations. Against these people, Stade kept a continual guard when Heliodorus Hessis, son of Eobanus, Hessus, the famous Latin poet in Germany, came to visit him. Stade, to entertain his guest the better, went into the woods to hunt for venison, where he was taken by the Tupan Imba, of which the king marched in the rear with a great palm tree club, and carried him toward the seaside, so that he, with others that waited on the shore, might make up a cayawipa pique, that is, a feast of roasted men. But because Stade, being a German of a large body, well-skinned, young, plump, and fat, they all concluded to spare this dainty of certain death, and to be food for such ravenous cannibals, so macerated and consumed him, that he was almost dwindled away to skin and bone, whereupon thinking him thus lean to make but few savoury morsels, they changed their resolutions, and growing better acquainted, he having learned their tongue, and being able to discourse with them, they liked his company so well that they let him live. 9 years Stade had been a slave amongst these man-eaters, when the French coming thither bought him for a few trifles, and carried him to Normandy, where landing anno 1555, he went from thence to Hamburg, being his native country. Nicolas Durande, a Frenchman, set sail from Havre de Grace at the same time when Stade came thither. This Durande, having lost a castle in Britain to the great prejudice of the French, out of a pretence of advancing their affairs, and to fill up their almost exhausted treasury, reported that the Spanish and Portuguese forces were driven out of India, where they had gathered so much wealth, and it would certainly redound to the honour and profit of France if they could become masters of the gold and silver mines, King Henry II approving of the proposal, and the more because the Admiral Gaspar Coligny was also very earnest, looking upon it as a faith retreat for the Protestants, at that time cruelly persecuted, and Durande, sensible of the Admiral's thoughts, privately informed him that in his American design he chiefly aimed to plant a true Church of God in America, where the professors might enjoy themselves peaceably. This report being spread amongst those that called themselves Protestants, fled from Switzerland in great numbers to France, made many of them venture upon the design, who having fitted themselves and setting sail with 3 ships, after some time arrived on the coast of Brazil, the Rock Island in the haven January. Here Durande built several watch-houses and the fort Coligny, which he fortified with a considerable number of guns. Not long after he writ to John Calvin that he would please to furnish this new plantation in Brazil with good and able teachers of the gospel, which request being immediately taken into serious consideration by the classes. One Philip Courgilleray, a gentleman near Geneva, set sail out of the haven Honfleurs with 3 ships freighted with some provisions, several persons of diverse trades, and 2 ministers, Peter Richer and William Chartier. But he had scarce made Africa when they began to have a scarcity of victuals, wherefore they turned their design of settling the gospel in America to piracy, where they made small scruple or difference, whether friends or foes, but made prize of all they could light upon, though indeed their ministers both preached and persuaded the contrary, amongst whom a controversy happening put other business into their heads. For one John Cointac, formerly a Parisian Sorbonnist, was also amongst those that removed from Geneva, who pretended that Coligny had promised him a minister's place so soon as he landed at Brazil. But Richer and Chartier, not satisfied that there was any such promise, and consequently thinking themselves not obliged by his bare assertion, told him that themselves being able under God to perform the work, they needed no such coadjutor. This bred so great a rancour between them that Cointac accused them for teaching false doctrine, and chiefly that they did not mix the wine at their sacraments with water, which Father Clemens had strictly commanded. Durande, being prevailed on by the Cardinal of Lorraine, joined with Cointac, and thereupon so sharply persecuted the Protestants that he starved several of them, which others to escape fled to the Brazilians. Nay, he took John and carry him alive to Bricioca, that with such a banquet they might highly caress their wives. But the journey being long, and a just melancholy possessing him with fear and the terror du bordel, Matthias Vermeer and Peter Borden, out of their sick beds, and tying their hands and feet, threw them headlong from a rock into the sea. So, and after which, the bloody persecutor returned with ill success to France, where he wrote a book against the reformed religion. But all the honour which he gained was that all parties on both sides accounted him a distracted person. Florida being upon the continent of America, and so called by John Ponteus, who landed there upon Palm Sunday, though Sebastian Gaboto, a Venetian employed by Henry VII, King of England, landed there before, may well be termed the Europeans' bloody stage, Pontius being slain here. But Ferdinand Soto exercised inhumane cruelty against the inhabitants for 5 years together, yet at last died of deep discontent, because he could not reach his aims, having condemned so many Floridians fruitlessly to dig for gold in the mines. However, since then Julian Sumenius and Peter Ahumada undertook the work anew, but with the same bad success. In the year 1545, one Lodowick Cancelo, a Dominican, thought to effect great things with 4 of his associates, but landing on Florida was destroyed by the natives. But Gaspar Coligny the Marshal, neither discouraged by these miserable proceedings, nor the former treachery of Durande, prepared for a new expedition there, and accordingly John Ribauld was fitted with 2 ships from Dieppe, at the charge of Charles IX, King of France. With these ships, having sailed to 30 degrees northern latitude, he came before the promontory of Francisco, where he ran up into the mouth of a wide river, which he named Dolphin, and its banks were full of mulberry woods that nourished silkworms in strange abundance. Sailed by the Wolf's Head, a point so called because great numbers of wolves breed there, and leaving Cedar Island, he landed on Florida, where he built a triangular fort. After furnishing it with men, guns, and provisions, he sailed back to France for more supplies. However, upon his arrival, he found all things in disorder due to a war among themselves. So the French who guarded and dwelt in the fort waited in vain for relief, and their provisions grew scarce. They decided it was best to build a vessel and sail away. After accomplishing this, and having sailed about 1/3 of their voyage, a calm lasting 20 days occurred, and they made no progress. This drove them to extreme desperation as their provisions ran out. They resorted to drinking their own urine and eating their old shoes. When those supplies also ran out, they agreed among themselves to kill and eat one of their seamen, named Henry Lacher, and they survived on his flesh for a few days. But as they faced the greatest imaginable want in this extremity of despair, with their condition being altogether hopeless, an English frigate discovered them. Recognizing their dire situation by their manner of sailing, the frigate approached and sent their longboat aboard. They found the French so weak that they were unable to handle their tack. Generously taking pity on them, the English relieved them and escorted them to the coast of England. They were then brought to Queen Elizabeth, who had previously planned to prepare a fleet for Florida. Meanwhile, no news had been heard of the aforementioned French plantation. In Brasilia, and Coligny's difference with the king being decided, he prevailed so much that Renatus Laudonnière should sail with 3 ships to relieve the garrison in the recently deserted fort. Laudonnière landed in Nova Francia and found a stone with a French inscription placed on the shore by Ribald, adorned with laurel garlands. Then he visited King Satouriona, whose son Autorcus had several children by his own mother, according to a savage custom observed in that country. While they stayed there, a fiery meteor appeared in the sky with such intensity that some rivers boiled and the fish, partially cooked, died. Moreover, it scorched all the plants far and near. The natives attributed this plague to the French cannons, which caused them great fear. The French could have accomplished great things if they hadn't had differences among themselves. A seaman named Rubel Patricon, claiming to have skill in necromancy, pretended to show the places where the gold and silver mines were. The other seamen believed him and rebelled against Laudonnière. Despite being sick, Laudonnière was imprisoned and forced to sign a writing stating that the 2 ships, commanded by the rebels Vassar and Trinquant, would sail to New Spain for provisions with his permission. While they were preparing for their voyage, Rupiferai, who had been sent to King Eutina, returned with many rich presents and information about the gold and silver mines in Appalachia. However, Vassar and Trinquant ignored this information and set forth. They captured a Spanish caravel heavily laden before Havana and agreed to release the commander upon payment of a large ransom. However, when the commander's son was sent ashore to fetch the money, he revealed his father's misfortune. Consequently, 2 large frigates and a galley were sent the next morning to attack the French, resulting in a fierce encounter. But in a short time, the 2 pirates were sunk, and the prisoners were sold as slaves, except for a few who escaped in their longboat. During this time, Laudonnière received no supply from France, and was brought to great extremity as the rebels had taken a large part of his stores with them. In these dire straits, against the recent peace agreement with King Eutina, Laudonnière was forced by those who stayed with him to take him prisoner in the hope that he would obtain provisions for them in exchange for his freedom. However, the inhabitants, outraged by the treachery of this unexpected action, could not be persuaded to provide them with relief. They became even more obstinate and held a general meeting to elect another king. Thus, losing all hope, they resigned themselves to their impending doom. In this desperate condition, John Hawkins, a renowned sea captain, arrived with 4 English ships and, pitying their misery, provided them with necessities. Since he only had 4 vessels, he loaned them 1 because Laudonnière was too weak at that time to endure the sea. After regaining his strength, and with everything ready to set sail, Ribald arrived with 7 ships from Dieppe and anchored. A few days later, the Spanish Admiral Peter Melendez arrived with 8 frigates. The French received intelligence of this and cut their cables, sailing out to sea. The Spaniards pursued them but couldn't catch up. They left them and landed at the mouth of the River Dolphin, where they began to fortify themselves with the help of Moorish slaves. Ribald, upon receiving notice, immediately sailed there to at least disturb, if not completely drive them away from their work. However, they were surprised on the way by a severe storm and lost most of their fleet, which became entangled among the rocks. Yet most of the men managed to save themselves. In this storm, the Spaniards also suffered great damage but took advantage of the Frenchmen's misfortune by marching quickly to Charles' fort. There were only 200 weak men left in the fort since Ribald had taken the best soldiers with him. In the morning before sunrise, the Spaniards launched a fierce assault and quickly became masters of the place. Laudonnière, upon seeing this, fled in a boat, while others jumped from the walls into the moat and saved themselves by swimming. Anyone who fell into the hands of the victors was mercilessly killed. Moreover, the Spaniards had such deep-rooted hatred towards the French that they displayed their cruelty even towards the dead. They pulled out their eyes and cut off their body parts, triumphantly carrying them on the tips of their swords. Meanwhile, the storm subsided and Ribald approached Charles Fort with his damaged fleet. However, he was astonished when he saw the Spanish flag flying on the walls and Valemond marching towards him with a squadron of Spaniards. Even though a river separated them, Ribald immediately entered into a treaty and surrendered all his men, numbering over 400, upon the promise of good treatment. However, instead of honoring the agreement, the Spaniards bound them and led them all to the castle. Contrary to the terms of the treaty and the laws of warfare, they massacred them and burned their bodies. Ribald, quartered, had his limbs placed on poles around the walls, and his head was sent to Seville. When Charles X, the King of France, received news of this, he showed no concern for the Spanish cruelty towards his subjects, due to his particular hatred for Coligny, the primary instigator of the voyage, while the French crown disregarded the inhumane treatment by the Spaniards in Charles' fort. Dominicus Gurgey was deeply affected by it. He converted all his belongings into money and raised 200 soldiers and 80 sailors, whom he put aboard 3 small ships. He claimed that he would only make a brief stop in Brazil, but sailed beyond Cuba directly to Florida. Upon landing, he was warmly received by King Satouriona, who had the command of a large army and had much to complain about regarding Spanish oppression. By this time, the Spaniards had not only strengthened Charles' fort, but had also established 2 other forts on each side of the Mayo River, with a garrison of over 400 elite soldiers. The defenders in the new forts offered little resistance and fled into a nearby wood, where they fell into an ambush set by the Indians. 30 of them were slain and 90 were spared for a public execution. Victorious, they marched towards Charles' fort. Along the way, 60 Spaniards who sallied out were all killed, which greatly facilitated the Frenchman's task. Governor Melendez, realizing he had no escape, fled into the woods, but encountered the Floridians. He returned to the French, begging for his life and the lives of some of his people. However, Gurgey, unmoved by his pleas, rejected them all. Pressing forward, he took them all prisoners, and, as a just retribution for their cruelty towards his countrymen, hanged them on the nearest tree. After this execution, it is difficult to express how warmly the natives welcomed the French, grateful for freeing the country from Spanish oppression. Having accomplished his mission, Gurgey returned home and was warmly received in Rochelle. However, he received no support or recognition from the king for all his efforts. The Cardinal of Lorraine even told him that for his good service he deserved to be put to death because he had equipped 3 ships without authorization. Captain Frobisher sailed to the northern parts of America in 1576, choosing a bad time as the year was too far advanced and the ocean was filled with ice. He was forced to return to England. Not long after, he embarked on another voyage with the support of Queen Elizabeth. She equipped a frigate and 2 ketches under his command, manned by a crew of 140 men. On May 26th, they weighed anchor and sailed to the Orkneys, located north of Scotland. Upon landing, they discovered that the poor islanders had fled from their huts to seek refuge in caves and dens among the rocks. From there, Frobisher steered north-northwest, navigating through numerous floating pieces of timber that often impeded their progress. On July 4th, they reached Friesland, where they encountered a severe storm of hail mixed with snow. A large ridge of ice lay before the shore, hindering their landing for some time. In this area, they caught sight of several indigenous people, but were unable to communicate with them as they fled upon any approach. However, when they had the advantage, these natives put up a resistance. Eventually, 3 unarmed individuals approached the shore, beckoning Frobisher to come to them. He would have done so if not for the sudden appearance of a large number of natives who emerged from an ambush in the woods and behind a hill. Realizing they had been discovered, the natives retreated into the interior of the country, leaving only 3 individuals on the shore. Of the 3, the one in the middle pretended to be lame but eventually fell down. His companions picked him up and carried him for a short distance before abandoning him. Observing their intentions, the Englishmen fired their guns, causing sand to fly all around the fallen native. Overcoming his feigned lameness, he ran swiftly up a hill like a deer. At this point, Frobisher's men had filled 2 barrels with a mineral substance resembling gold, but it was later determined to be of little value. Apart from this discovery, nothing remarkable was found, except for the presence of tall, long-haired men who were extremely savage and cunning in their intentions to murder others. They lurked like wild beasts, waiting to prey on men whom they would catch and tear apart. These indigenous people wore the skins of various wild animals, with the tails hanging between their legs as a source of pride. Their tents were made of joined whale bones, covered with similar skins, always facing south. They used bows, arrows, slings, and 2 types of boats. The larger boats could accommodate 17 men, and were constructed by clenching together several wooden planks and covering both sides with leather. The smaller boats were covered in the same manner, resembling a weaver's shuttle, and had a hole in the middle where a man would sit. Drawing the cover of the boat around his waist using strings, he could swiftly navigate with a single oar. The country itself was barren, but supported a large population of deer, hares, wolves, bears, and dog-like wolves. The inhabitants relied on the flesh of these animals for sustenance. It appeared that this region experienced frequent earthquakes, as evidenced by the numerous rocks and mountains that had been split apart in various locations. On August 4th, Frobisher reached a latitude of 68 degrees, surpassing the previous exploration of Sebastian Cabot, the first discoverer of these parts who had been sent out by King Henry VIII. Sailed northward, Sir Francis Drake, also supported by Queen Elizabeth, embarked on a different course. He sailed along the African coast, passing Cape Blanco and Cape Verde, until he reached Brazil. There, he captured several sea wolves and anchored them in the river La Plata to obtain fresh water. Continuing his voyage through the treacherous Strait of Magellan, he arrived at the island of Mocha, which was washed by the South Sea. The islanders received him cordially, as they had heard about the English being engaged in a great war with the Spaniards. To escape the Spaniards' cruelties, these islanders had abandoned the mainland and settled on Mocha. One of the Mochans boarded Drake's ship and served as a pilot to the port of Valparaiso. There, Drake burned the small village of St. Jago and plundered the surrounding countryside, amassing a significant treasure of gold and silver. Before reaching Arica, he captured 3 Spanish ships that were heavily laden with valuable cargo. Near Lima, he seized 4 more ships carrying an invaluable treasure of pearls and gold. Enriched by these exploits, Drake initially steered his course northward to a latitude of 42 degrees. However, due to the cold weather, he was forced to sail 4 degrees southward, where he discovered a pleasant and inhabited coast. The people there showed him great kindness, and the king himself boarded Drake's ship with a grand entourage. The king placed a gold crown on Drake's head and bestowed upon him a golden scepter and an ivory chain. Afterward, Drake explored the islands of Tidore, Ternate, Java, Ceylon, and the Cape of Good Hope. Following a 3-year voyage that circumnavigated the world, he safely returned to London. He did not rest for long, as in 1585 he set sail for America. There, he captured significant prizes from the cities of St. Jago, St. Domingo, St. Augustine, and Cartagena, setting them all on fire. Once again returning home victoriously, and after his famous defeat of Vanish Armada, Sir Francis Drake prepared a new fleet with Captain Hawkins as his vice-admiral. Their intended mission was to sail to Panama, but both captains died, and with their passing, the grand and lucrative project also came to an end. A year after the death of these renowned navigators, Captain Thomas Candish, with a crew of 120 men and provisions for 2 years, embarked on a fortunate journey to circumnavigate the world for the 2nd time. Passing through the Strait of Magellan, he acquired a fortune exceeding 10 times the cost of his expedition by capturing the Spanish carrack Santa Ana, which carried an estimated 20 tons of gold. Laden with a vast treasure, he safely arrived in the River Thames. However, Captain John Smith had much worse luck. In 1614, he set sail with 2 ships funded by London merchants to New England. Their objective was to collect copper, gold, and other minerals on Monhegan Island and engage in whale fishing. Unfortunately, they found no such minerals and were unable to catch whales due to the season. Consequently, Smith returned home empty-handed. Nevertheless, they attempted the expedition once again, but with even worse fortune. As they approached Virginia, they were treacherously attacked and captured by the French. The French accused Smith of destroying plantations in Nova Francia and threatened him with death unless he made reparations for the damages. Smith was taken as a prisoner to Rochelle on a French ship. However, not far from there they encountered a violent storm. Smith seized the opportunity, leaping into a boat and braving the waves, until he was ultimately thrown onto the island of Oleron. Having lost everything, he was rescued by an English ship and brought back to his homeland. 5 ships were prepared in Rotterdam for an expedition to the Netherlands, under the command of Jacques Mahou and Simon de Cordes. On June 27, 1598, they weighed anchor from Gourie and set sail on a vast voyage. Eventually, they landed on the island of St. Jago, where they captured a strong castle and 2 balquets. However, they entered into an agreement with the Portuguese to freely access fresh water. Despite this agreement, the Portuguese, disregarding their promises, attacked the Dutch with 200 horsemen, each accompanied by a foot soldier. The Dutch put up a brave resistance, causing the Portuguese to flee. The city of St. Jago, after which the entire island is named. Elongated in shape and features, a convenient crescent-shaped harbour, a river flows through the city, flanked by several tall mountains beyond the town. The part of the city facing the sea is fortified with strong bulwarks. The Portuguese had positioned their cannons towards the sea, intending to sink the Dutch ships that they had lured there under false pretenses of friendship. However, a severe storm prevented the fleet. From there, sailing to the desolate island of Brava, they came across nothing but 5 ruined houses. The door of one of the houses was blocked by large stones, but when they were removed, it was discovered to be filled with Turkish wheat, which was a great kindness to the sailors. Meanwhile, Admiral Mahou passed away, and his body was placed in a chest filled with stones and thrown overboard. Simon de Cordes, now carrying the flag, set his course for Guinea to replenish supplies. Most of his men were weakened by scurvy to the point where they could barely handle the sails. Upon arriving at their intended port, the sick were taken ashore. Vice Admiral Beuningen, guided by a French guide, went to meet the Viceroy of the region. The Viceroy was seated on a low bench with a sheepskin beneath his feet, dressed in a violet-coloured cloth suit without any linen, shirt, shoes, or stockings. He wore a cap made of yellow, red, and blue Eastern cloth, and his face, whitened with ashes, revealed its natural blackness in several places beneath the colours. He had a collar or chain of glass beads around his neck. His nobles, with cock's feathers on their heads and red-painted skin, sat behind him. Beuningen, seated on a mat at the king's command, expressed his complaint that the Guineans fled from him wherever he went, even in friendly encounters meant for trading European goods for fruits, poultry, sheep, and other provisions. In response, the king promised to provide him with the desired provisions and invited Beuningen to have dinner. After some time, the king's wives entered the palace, a humble and unattractive building resembling more of a large barn than a royal residence. They placed a kind of unsightly trough on the ground, containing nothing but wild herbs and a piece of smoked sea calf. Despite his large size and corpulence, the king ate sparingly. Beuningen, though extremely hungry, found little appeal in such food. He then spread a napkin, and his attendants brought him some biscuits and designated location. Only 2 of the ships managed to sail relatively close, but not within range of the Portuguese guns. After the king had tasted the Spanish wine and enjoyed its flavour, it made him sleepy. Meanwhile, Beuningen walked to the seaside to refresh himself. However, the Guineans approached him, and he was forced to return to the king. Upon waking up to the noise, the king appeared highly angry with his people and took Beuningen into his house. Despite the king's commands, the subjects kept watch around the neighbouring hut where Beuningen was sent for the night. Early the next morning, an old woman entered, muttering to herself. She went in and out of Beuningen's presence 3 times in succession, knocking on a box that resembled a pair of bellows. This caused a great amount of dust to fly about Beuningen, which amused the Guineans and resulted in laughter. The king also came to Beuningen and presented him with 2 goats and 4 hens before conducting him back to the ships. Realizing that there was nothing more to be gained, Beuningen set sail from there. Upon arriving at the river La Plata in America, the water appeared blood. When water was taken up in buckets, insects resembling fleas emerged, causing a strange and distressing illness among the sailors. Whenever they tried to eat, they would immediately fall backward in a swoon, foaming at the mouth and rolling their eyes, ultimately dying in a state of madness. Suffering from this disaster, they quickly departed and sailed into the Straits of Magellan. There, they killed over 1,400 penguins, birds that prey on fish and live in underground holes. These penguins somewhat resemble geese, but stand more upright and have double crests with 2 feathery combs. Anchoring in the Green Bay, a severe storm arose that lasted several days. They were forced to secure their vessels with 4 anchors. They endured extreme hunger and cold, surviving by eating young sprouts that were no more than a span high above the ground. However, this meager food led to an incurable dropsy, causing them to die suddenly. When the weather became more pleasant, the inhabitants, who were giants standing 11 feet tall, became more troublesome. They frequently attacked the Dutch sailors, skillfully throwing darts pointed like harpoons. Their savage nature was evident in their treatment of deceased Dutch sailors. They decapitated them, smashed their bodies, impaled them with darts through their hearts, and mutilated their genitals. Finally, the fleet, facing severe weather conditions, became separated from each other in the South Sea. 2 ships, the Faith and the Good Tidings, were driven back into the Straits of Magellan, where they experienced extreme hunger. They captured a wild woman and 2 children. The woman and children had a sallow complexion, protruding bellies, wide mouths, crooked legs, long heels, and breasts resembling cow udders. The woman wore a string of snail shells around her neck and had a beast's skin on her back fastened with sinews. Their diet consisted solely of live birds, which the children also consumed. The youngest child, only 6 months old, had a mouth full of teeth and could run without assistance. They took the eldest child to Amsterdam, but after keeping the woman on board for 2 nights, they gave her various trinkets and set her ashore. They discovered old ice, 4 feet thick, in the middle of summer. Beuningen remained in the Straits of Magellan, but exhausted by hunger, cold, and storms, he eventually returned home. If not for an accidental encounter with another ship, they may have all perished in those treacherous waters. If they had not taken an abundance of cones, they would have all perished. This unfortunate voyage lasted for over 2 years, and they finally arrived in their homeland with only 36 men remaining alive out of the original 105. Section 16. The Expedition of Oliver van Noord. 2 months after Mahu, Oliver van Noord set sail with 4 ships and 248 men from the Mayas. Upon reaching Prince's Island, he lost 7 of his men due to the treachery of the Portuguese. Anchoring before the city of Aveiro, they received a similarly unwelcoming reception from the Portuguese. A battle ensued, resulting in significant losses on both sides. Van Noord then sailed towards St. Sebastian, a fruitful island known for an herb that is effective against scurvy. The sailors discovered an abundance of sea mews, parrots, and various delicious fish. With winter approaching, they decided not to enter the Straits of Magellan so late in the season. Instead, they sought a suitable harbor to allow their sick crew members to recuperate. Although they initially intended to choose the fertile St. Helena Island for this purpose, they were impeded by a severe storm. They ended up in St. Clara, where they replenished their fresh water supply and anchored in Porto Desire. In this harbor, they encountered a species of sea dogs, whose front parts were covered in long hair resembling a lion with feet resembling human hands. These animals had black and white hair above their eyes and upper lips, which stood upright in stormy weather but lay flat during calm periods. They urinated backwards, slept soundly, and gave birth every month. When boiled, their flesh proved to be a savory dish. Upon going ashore, Van Noord found no human presence, only burial sites on high rocks constructed with red stones and adorned with bows, arrows, and other peculiar objects. Square shells and intricately carved items lay beneath the heads of the deceased. Driven by curiosity, Van Noord and his men rowed up a river for an entire tidal cycle. When their boat ran aground during low tide, Van Noord ventured several leagues inland, encountering only deer, buffaloes, and ostriches. Assuming the coast to be uninhabited due to the absence of people, he returned. However, upon the sailors disregarding his orders to remain in the boat, they were viciously attacked by 30 aggressive natives. 3 sailors were killed, and another was wounded in the leg. These indigenous people were strong and wild, with painted faces and long hair. After this encounter, they encountered no further hostile interactions. After spending 14 months in exploration and losing 100 men, Van Noord set sail again with 3 ships. They burnt one of the ships, Unity, at Clara Island, where they had wintered due to an uncontrollable leak. They acquired 5,000 fowls on the island, significantly increasing their food supplies. They then crossed the vast ocean into the Straits of Magellan, attempting 4 times to enter the South Sea but being repeatedly pushed back by adverse weather conditions into the straits. However, on their 5th attempt, they succeeded. Once through, they left the straits behind and sailed forward. The fleet discovered 2 islands, and when the sailors went ashore on one of them, They brought back 4 boys and 2 girls. These children later learned their language and provided information about the surrounding countries. Afterward, the fleet sailed to Hunger's Haven, where they found the ruins of the abandoned Philipsstad. Captain Thomas Candish had seen the fortified city 14 years earlier, with 4 bastions. However, only a few houses, a church, and a gallows remained. 400 Spaniards had built the city as a key strategic point for the Straits of Magellan. Over the course of 3 years, their provisions were depleted and no relief arrived from Spain. The indigenous people destroyed their crops, leading to a severe famine. Many died without even removing their clothes, and their unburied bodies caused a foul stench in the city. The survivors fled to the fields, where they survived for a year on fruits, herbs, and roots. Eventually 23 of them, including 2 women, decided to travel to the river Plata. Their fate remains unknown, except for one member of their group named Ferdinando, who stumbled upon Candish's fleet. In this location, Van Noord left Vice Admiral Jacob Clairsoun Ilpendam ashore due to his committed crimes. Departing from there, they sailed through the South Sea along the coasts of Chile and Mocha. A sizable island with a forked mountain at its center had a convenient river flowing through the country. The inhabitants guided the Dutch sailors to their village, consisting of around 50 straw houses. However, the sailors were forbidden from entering their huts. When the men called out, the women appeared divided into 3 groups and humbly kneeled before them. An old woman then brought an earthen vessel filled with sikar, a liquor made from maize. Its extracted juice, boiled and fermented in tubs with a cap of yeast, resembled beer or ale. The Hollanders drank in moderation and felt refreshed. However, the natives would continue drinking this liquor until they became intoxicated and mad. From there, Van Noord set course for Sancta Maria. On the way, they captured a Spanish ship named Buon Jesus, Good Jesus, and learned from the prisoners that Admiral Simon de Cordes and 23 men were killed by the Americans at the Lavapia promontory, opposite St. Mary's. A year earlier, news of Cordes' fleet had reached Lima, prompting preparations to resist them. Hindered by strong contrary winds, Van Noord was unable to reach Sancta Maria and instead headed directly for St. Jago. In the harbor, a large Spanish ship full of indigenous people was present, along with 2 others arriving. He set fire to the 2 incoming ships and towed the 3rd toward his fleet. Van Noord deeply regretted giving Francisco de Ibarra, the commander of Buon Jesus, his freedom, and allowing him to go ashore. The Spanish pilot informed him later that Ibarra had thrown overboard 10,200 pounds of gold, packed in 52 cases, when he realized he was about to lose his ship. Continuing their journey, the fleet dropped anchor near Thieves Island, inhabited by light-fingered people who were naked and physically strong. The women on the island had been disfigured by syphilis, with their noses, lips, and cheekbones affected. In the Bay La Baia, the Dutch admiral, with a Spanish flag on his mast, sent one of his sailors ashore disguised as a friar, hoping to obtain provisions. Their plan succeeded, and they were supplied with all kinds of food. Following that, the Dutch sailors burned 5 villages on Kapul Island. They captured a Chinese vessel, a Spanish barco, and a caravel loaded with brandy from Cocos. In a great and bloody battle, they also sank the flagship of the Manila fleet. Finally, after facing various fortunes, they arrived in Rotterdam, having circled the world in 3 years. Section 17. The Expedition of George van Spielberg. In the year 1614, on the 8th of August, the East India Company of the United Netherlands dispatched 7 ships under the command of George Spilbergen. Upon reaching Cape St. Vincent, they engaged in a battle with the Portuguese and captured one of their ships. They then proceeded towards the Straits of Magellan, but a severe storm caused the fleet to scatter. Among the ships that were separated was the vessel called Meru, where some of the crew had conspired to kill the captain and take control of the ship. However, the captain had suspected their plans and bravely attacked 2 of the main conspirators with his drawn hanger, forcing them to jump overboard. He then took charge and restored order among the rest of the crew. Upon landing on one of the Penguin Islands, Spilbergen discovered 2 bodies buried in the ground. Around their necks were chains made of shiny snail shells carefully strung together. The graves were adorned with bows and arrows and situated amidst several towering mountains, their peak covered in snow. The fleet eventually emerged from the Straits of Magellan, but not without facing significant dangers. The South Sea, disturbed by violent storms, appeared to unleash its fury. Waves reaching up to the sky, keeping them engaged among the rocks, posed a great challenge for the Dutch fleet. However, they managed to anchor before La Mosha with great difficulty, narrowly escaping danger. La Mosha is an island that lies low on the north side and is protected by rocks on the south. Spielbergen noticed many people standing on the shore and rode there to engage in trade. Among them, there was a peculiar sheep with a long neck, humpbacked like a camel, a small mouth and long legs. These animals served as substitutes for horses, carrying burdens and aiding in agriculture. The local inhabitants bred these sheep everywhere, with some individuals owning as many as 1,800. The shepherds rode on an ox-like beast and carried copper plates adorned with bells in their hands. They would shake these plates to create different sounds, guiding the movement of the sheep. Additionally, they wore feathers on their heads like upright coronets. Departing from La Mocha, Spielbergen eventually landed on the island of St. Mary, where he burned down all the Spanish villages. He did the same in Valparaiso. In the Quintero harbor, they observed a large number of wild horses drinking from a stream that flowed from a nearby steep mountain. As soon as the horses spotted the men, they quickly ran away and disappeared. Continuing their journey and sailing for a month, they spotted 8 large ships. The prisoners informed them that it was the Spanish fleet commanded by Rodrigo de Mendoza, specifically prepared to engage in battle with Spielbergen. The arrival of Spielbergen's fleet had been known for a year. At midnight, Mendoza's forces boarded Spielbergen's ship, but were repelled with great force, resulting in the loss of the ship St. Francisco. At daybreak, the Dutch admiral opened fire on Mendoza, who responded with equal courage. A fierce battle ensued, in which the Spaniards found themselves in a difficult situation and raised a white flag. However, the flag was quickly taken down by the Spanish commanders, as they preferred to die rather than surrender. This was due to their mockery of Mendoza when he mentioned the difficulty of the mission during the Grand Peruvian Council. They had belittled the idea, stating that they were only going to capture a few disabled Dutch sailors, tie them up, and execute them. Their pride and arrogance proved fatal, as they were later defeated, routed, and mostly sunk during their retreat. After this victory, the Dutch sailed triumphantly to Callao de Lima, a city with a convenient harbor. The city boasted beautiful houses and temples and was fortified with a platform equipped with large cannons facing the sea. The shore was guarded by 8 troops of horse and 4,000-foot soldiers. Recognizing the overwhelming number of the enemy and not wishing to risk the loss of all their resources in a battle, Spielbergen decided not to engage in combat. Since they saw no hope of victory, they set sail for Gama, where they acquired fresh provisions. They fiercely bombarded the city of Paita with their cannons, causing the townspeople to abandon the area. Observing this, Spielbergen set the city on fire and sailed to Acapulco. Initially, the Spaniards from the fort fired some cannons at them, but their attitude quickly changed, and they reached an agreement, providing the Dutch with necessary provisions. Continuing their journey, they arrived at Selacuez, where some of the locals and Spaniards allowed some of the Dutch to land. They set upon them treacherously in a thicket, but it didn't benefit them much as the defenders put up a strong defense. The assailants couldn't withstand the resistance and fled, suffering significant losses. Afterwards, Spielbergen sailed from there to the Manillas, waiting for the Spanish Admiral Juan de Silva, who had reportedly made extensive preparations to face him. However, realizing that it was futile, he eventually returned to Zealand. In the summer of 1617, he anchored there with his ship, loaded with riches. Section 18. The expedition of William Corneliszoon Schouten and Jacob Lemaire. Some merchants, known as the Austrian Company, outfitted one ship with 65 crew members and a ketch with 22 sailors, appointing captains Schouten and Lemaire as their commanders. In the year 1615, they raised anchor from the Texel. The first place they visited was one of the 3 islands called Mabrabama, located in front of Cape Sierra Leone. This island, rising high out of the sea, was uninhabited. They only spotted 3 wild buffaloes, numerous wildcats, birds that barked like dogs, wild palm trees, lemon trees, turtles, crocodiles, partridges, and storks. Continuing their journey, they passed the perilous Abrolhos Shoal and arrived at Porto Desire. There, they found an abundance of eggs and small fish called spirings, along with 16-inch long seaweed, hence naming the inlet Spirings Bay. Their smaller boat also brought 2 sea lions and 150 penguins from the Penguin Isles after sailing 2 leagues up the river. During this time, the ground consisted of sheer rock, and their anchors slipped, causing the large ship to collide with planks, and ironwork broke off. Similarly, the ketch struck a high shelf, and at low tide, its keel was 2 fathoms above the waterline. It would have undoubtedly capsized and been damaged, but a fresh northwest wind kept it upright. Eventually, as the weather calmed, it listened to one side. However, with the rapidly rising tide, it was miraculously set afloat again, saving it from further harm. They then set sail again for King's Island, where they found an abundance of black mew eggs. One could reach over 50 nests without moving, and each nest contained at least 3 eggs. They collected thousands of these eggs on board. While rowing southward down the river in their boat, they encountered ostriches and creatures resembling stags, but with exceptionally long necks. On the hills, they discovered stacked stones beneath which were the bodies of 11-foot-long dead beings. They spent their time there cleaning their ships and resheathing the ketch. However, while applying tallow, a fire accidentally ignited between the crevices, reducing it to ashes. The large ship had sustained damage, with a horn embedded 7 feet underwater in its bow. This horn, solid and resembling a large elephant's tooth, pierced through 2 ash planks and 1 oak plank lodging in a rib of similar wood, with over half a foot remaining visible. Weighed anchor from Porto Desire and sailed to 45 degrees southern latitude. There he encountered numerous shoals of whales, necessitating him to maneuver to avoid them. Sea pies, larger than swans, flew in great numbers aboard their ship, allowing themselves to be captured. They observed a high and rugged coastline on the north side, spreading east-southeast, which they called the States Country. The area to the west of it was named Maurice of Nassau. The islands in 57 degrees were called Barneveld's Isles, and the sharp point where the snowy mountains lay south of the Magellan Straits was named Cape of Huhorn. Schouten had now reached a latitude of 59 degrees when he entered the South Sea through the new passage between Mauritius and the States Country, which was named the Straits of Le Maire after his partner. Near the 2 Juan Fernando Islands, they found a great abundance of fish. After exploring various scattered islands in the South Sea, they named each of them according to specific circumstances. The first island was called the Isle of Dogs, due to the presence of numerous dogs that couldn't bark. Another was named the Bottomless Island because the sea around it was so deep that they couldn't anchor. The inhabitants of these islands, who were naked with their bodies adorned with blue snakes, dragons, and other creatures, attacked the Dutch sailors with clubs attached with swordfish snouts and slings. They then came across Water, Land, and Flies Island. The former was named because the shore was covered with trees, while the center was submerged in salt water. The latter was named after the flies that bothered the sailors incessantly for 4 days. Furthermore, the reception Schouten received at the Horn Islands was quite remarkable, and we will briefly recount it. Anchoring in 9 fathoms of water with the Shelley seabed in front of a fresh river, 3 Dutch sailors sent to the king were warmly welcomed. The king displayed extreme humility by not bowing but instead kissing their feet, then lying flat on the ground and placing the sailors' feet on his neck. After this unusual greeting, the king accompanied them back to their ship. Although the king appeared subservient and humble, he ruled his subjects with great severity. Upon discovering a thief who had stolen a sword, he not only recovered and returned the sword, but also executed the thief in front of the Dutch sailors. The mayor and Arias Clairshoun were highly honored on the islands. Both the old and young kings placed crowns made of fine white feathers on their heads, decorated with small red and green feathers. They also presented each of them with a pigeon with white wings, a black hind part, and a red belly. Meanwhile, the king of Water Island visited the other king where Le Maire was being treated. They displayed extravagant acts of honor toward each other, but ultimately revealed their wildness by eating raw fish and engaging in rough dancing before the Dutch sailors. When Le Maire ventured into the countryside and climbed a high mountain, he found nothing but marshy wilderness and valleys submerged in water. The king and his entourage kept him company during his stay, and when they grew tired, they sat together under coconut trees. The young king skillfully climbed a tall tree, using a string tied around his leg, and brought down several coconuts, which he opened with great speed. One night, while Arias Clairshoun was rowing ashore, he found the king sitting under a roof supported by 4 pillars. Several naked women danced before him to their own music, which involved playing a hollow instrument like a drum, wood, which produced a murmuring sound without any distinct tune. But the two kings meeting again, the next day complimented one another with more bizarre and ridiculous postures, sitting side by side under the roof, imploring their god with their hands folded and their heads bowed to the ground. At this meeting, 4 Holland trumpeters and drummers stood playing before the king, to the great admiration and amazement of the islanders, who had gathered in numbers near 10,000 upon hearing the news of the strangers, to attend the two kings. Soon after, a large group of commoners came, running there, who had a green herb called kava tied around their waists. Suddenly, they all began to chew this kava, spitting out the chewed portion into a large wooden trough. Then, adding water to it, they kneaded it together. Once done, they brought the liquor on their heads to the two kings, kneeling before them when presenting it. Despite receiving such honor from their subjects, they showed servile respect to the Hollander. With a pig, which they first placed on their heads, then kneeling, they put it down at the mare's feet, and bowing their heads to the ground, rose again. They wore their hair long, braided, and hanging on the left side of their heads down to their hips, tied at the end with 2 knots. The nobility had 2 such locks. All of them went naked, with their private parts only covered. The smallest of the men exceeded the tallest of the Dutchmen in height. The women had long breasts hanging like satchels down to their bellies, and were so shameless that they prostituted themselves to anyone in the sight of all men, and during low tide their business was to catch fish, which they greedily ate raw. After all this entertainment, weighing anchor from there, Schouten sailed along the coast of New Guinea, where 3 boats full of Negroes rowed towards them, slinging stones fiercely at them and persistently following their movements throughout the night. The next morning, 7 more boats arrived to assist the attackers, but they quickly fled upon being fired upon by the Dutch bullets. Yet 2 of the Negroes were taken, each wearing a ring in their nostrils. Sailing further, several boats came aboard them, and the rowers, breaking their several boats, came aboard them. Assegais or lances over their heads entered the ship. Their hair and beards, covered in lime, flew about as they danced on the decks after having eaten a good meal. However, they attempted to repay this kind entertainment with treachery. After going ashore, they returned in greater numbers and sat upon the anchors that lay over the bows of the ship. Taking advantage of a great calm, they tried to tow the ship towards the shore, while others threw stones and arrows. As soon as the Dutchmen fired their guns and wounded several of them, they all fled except for some who were taken prisoners. One of the prisoners, whom they later named Moses, proved to be of great service to them. But Lemaire was amazed at nothing more than when he saw several small houses built about 9 feet high on the next coast. From these houses, many deformed people emerged with crooked noses, bow legs, squint eyes, or twisted backs, all misshapen in one way or another. Finally, anchoring before Jacatra, the ship was stopped there by order of the East India Company. The men were divided and put aboard ships sailing from India to Holland. They arrived safely in Flushing after having sailed around the world in 2 years and 18 days. Section 18. Voyage of the Nassavian Fleet under the command of Jacques El Heremite and Hugo Chapenham. The United Netherlands, to diminish Spanish power, assembled a significant fleet, which they sent to try their luck in seizing whatever they could find in any of the havens washed by the South Sea. Jacques El Hermite commanded 10 ships, manned with 1637 men and equipped with 294 brass and iron guns. They set sail from Goree in the year of 1623. Upon reaching Cape Vincent, they encountered 11 Turkish pirates, whom they fought and defeated, reclaiming the Dutch ship that had been captured by them. At Roxen's Head, El Hermite pursued 15 Spanish ships and caught up with them, sinking 11 and capturing 4 loaded with sugar. They then anchored at Sofia and dispatched the ship and a frigate named the Greyhound to escort the captured prizes back home. Upon receiving information that 30 Spanish ships were heading their way, they sailed into the harbour of St. Vincent. Unfortunately, the spring water they used to replenish their empty casks was brackish, causing gastrointestinal irritation that led to dysentery and the loss of many sailors. The crew was warmly received by the natives of Antonio. They continued their journey to Sierra Leone, a mountainous point abundant with lime trees, where they discovered the names of Sir Francis Drake and other Englishmen carved into a rock. Afterward, they made a stop at the fruitful island of Annobon, where El Hermite ordered the execution of his surgeon, beheading him. This wicked man, upon being subjected to torture, confessed nothing regarding the crimes attributed to him. However, when he was stripped for execution, a small bag hanging from his chest was discovered, containing a snake's skin and tongue, with which he had poisoned several men, but he confessed nothing. On the 1st of February, the fleet arrived at Cape Bepemias, which they recognized from a great distance due to its high mountains covered in snow. Shortly after, while sailing near the mouth of the Straits of Le Maire, they encountered very stormy weather, and 17 of their men who went ashore were devoured by the cannibals of Tierra del Fuego. These people, who are all white and of large stature, paint themselves red and go completely naked, except for some of higher rank who wear a deerskin around their necks. The women cover their nudity with a piece of leather. They live in round huts made of tree branches, staked 3 feet deep in the ground, similar to our tents, but with an open top to let out smoke like a chimney. They possess no other household items except for a few baskets in which they store their fishing tools. They are always armed with clubs, arrows, slings, and stone knives. Their boats are hollowed tree trunks that curve up like a half moon at the front and back. They measure 14 to 16 feet in length and 2 feet in width, and they row faster than a pinnace with multiple oars. They are so savage that they appear more like beasts than men, lacking any religion, being ill-natured, cruel, and treacherous. Continuing their journey, El Hermite took a break at the desolate island of Fernando, and then steered towards Cala de Lima. On the coast, they captured a Spanish vessel, and the prisoners informed them that the Spanish Plate Fleet had already weighed anchor and gone to Panama, carrying 40 brass guns and accompanied by 50 merchant ships, remained close to the shore, guarded by 3 stone bulwarks fortified with 50 guns. El Hermite had a plan to attack them, and captured 3 Spanish vessels that were heading in that direction. At midnight, he sent Captain Adrian Toll, Peter Slobbe, and Myndet Egbertsen with 12 well-manned boats armed with brass drakes and hand grenades to assault the Spanish fleet nearby. While some created a false alarm to the north of Callao, the boats rowed from ship to ship and quickly set fire to 40 of them. Despite the Spaniards' attempts to drive back the enemy with their shots from the shore, neither the fort nor the admiral's ship spared powder or cannonballs. In this brave feat, the Dutch had only 7 men killed and 15 wounded. At daybreak, 7 of the Spanish ships, ablaze, floated towards the Dutch fleet, resembling menacing fireships, prompting them to weigh anchor and avoid the danger. Afterwards, El Hermite seized 2 ships loaded with wine, a third filled with wood, and a fourth carrying wheat. They prepared one of these prizes as a fireship and sent it to board the Spanish admiral. However, it ran aground within firing range of the admiral's ship. It was then battered by the admiral's ship. It was then battered by the admiral's guns and those from the bulwarks, eventually catching fire and causing only minimal damage. During this time, while their plan was progressing successfully, their admiral El Hermite passed away. He was buried on the island of Lima. In defiance of the viceroy in Callao, Chapanam had 21 Spaniards hanged from the yardarm because of the scornful response they received regarding the proposals for the release of prisoners. Cornelius Jacobzoon, sailing to Pisco with 4 ships from the fleet, was able to accomplish no good from there, as not only did he find the city surrounded by a 15-foot-high wall, but there were also numerous earthen redoubts, behind which more than 2,000 armed men were stationed. Therefore, he abandoned the city after some skirmishes. However, Rear Admiral John William Zoon Verschoor, who was sent to Guayaquil, had much better luck. He not only captured the metropolis, but also burned a new royal galleon and 2 smaller vessels. He carried a captured ship to Lima, killed over 100 Spaniards, and threw 17 overboard for using poisoned bullets in violation of the laws of warfare. Captain Engelbert Schottel had the greatest honor in this conquest. However, the sailors grew weaker and weaker due to scurvy, and all of them would have perished if they had not discovered a powerful herb on the highest mountains of Lima. Chapanam was chosen as the admiral in place of Lima Hermite. They weighed anchor from Callao and sailed into the Pescadores Inlet, where they erected a fortification on the shore. However, they soon departed without achieving any significant results, and lost 28 men due to the poor leadership of their commanders. They also lost the same number at Acapulco, where a castle with 4 strong bulwarks stood. The Dutch fireship lay just out of the range of enemy fire, while the rest of the fleet lined up along the shore to capture the vessels expected from the Manillas. However, due to the ravages of scurvy among the sailors, Rendering them incapacitated, they waited in vain. Chaponham sailed through the South Sea to the Ladrons, where they found an abundance of provisions. In March 1625, he dropped anchor before Merle and then went with Herman van Spalt, the governor for the East India Company in Amboina, to Ceram, where they conquered Fort Loco and soon after Cambella. Subsequently, the fleet was divided, with Chaponham taking 2 ships back to Batavia, while the remainder returned at different times, having been hired to serve the East India Company in Surat, Malacca, Coromandel, and the Molucca Islands. Chaponham died near Bantam and was buried in Pulo. The ships arrived at the Texel in July 1616. Henry Brewer, his voyage. In the year 1643, Brewer set sail with 4 ships from Recife and sailed close along the States Isle, which was so dangerous and rocky that he did not dare to approach the land. Around the ships there were numerous multicolored ducks with sharp bills flying and whales swimming beneath the keel. On the west side of the Strait of Le Maire, Brown sailed into Valentine's Inlet, where he encountered troublesome winds that whistled through the hollow mountains with sudden and strong gusts. The shore offered red and black strawberries, cockles, and mussels, providing great refreshment for the sailors. They also observed sea lions, but were unable to shoot any of them, as the moment they noticed anyone, they would dive under the water and swim away. Although they came across footprints measuring 18 inches in length, they never encountered any people. Continuing their journey into the South Sea along the coast of Chile, they arrived at a bay they named Brewer's Haven. Upon landing, they walked toward a large smoke they had seen in the distance, but found only 2 houses in a vast plain filled with sheep, oxen, and horses. Wooden crosses stood in front of the houses. The Dolphin Pink and a large boat were sent to the inlet and anchored near a high mountain for the night. During the night, 2 loud cannons were fired, prompting Lieutenant William Terburgen to land with his troops. In the year 1643, Brewer set sail with 4 ships from Recife and sailed close along the States Isle, which was so dangerous and rocky that he did not dare to approach the land. Around the ships there were numerous multicolored ducks with sharp bills flying and whales swimming beneath the keels. On the west side of the Strait of Le Maire, Brown sailed into Valentine's Inlet, where he encountered troublesome winds that whistled through the hollow mountains with sudden and strong gusts. The shore offered red and black strawberries, cockles, and mussels, providing great refreshment for the sailors. They also observed sea lions, but were unable to shoot any of them, as the moment they noticed anyone, they would dive under the water and swim away. Although they came across footprints measuring 18 inches in length, they never encountered any people. Continuing their journey into the South Sea along the coast of Chile, they arrived at a bay they named Brewer's Haven. Upon landing, they walked toward a large smoke they had seen in the distance, but found only 2 houses in a vast plain filled with sheep, oxen, and horses. Wooden crosses stood in front of the houses. The Dolphin Pink and a large boat were sent to the inlet and anchored near a high mountain for the night. During the night, 2 loud cannons were fired, prompting Lieutenant William Terburgen to land with his troop. 16 musketeers climbed up the mountain and discovered a village behind it, where there was a great alarm with drums beating, trumpets sounding, and bells ringing. The villagers immediately opened fire on Terburgen and his 34 men. However, Terburgen and his 34 men valiantly causing the enemy to flee into the woods, although they suffered some losses of men and horses. The guns used by the enemy during the night were found only in a redoubt. Terburgen pursued the victory and marched into the woods, where he shot the Spanish commander Andreas Muniz y Serrera from his horse. They also discovered a hidden treasure under a tree, which had been brought from Carromapu. Terburgen set fire to the village and killed all the horses. Then, with Admiral Brewer, they set sail to Michael de Cabuco, where they were unable to land due to the presence of numerous rocks and shoals. They proceeded to Castro, which they conquered and burned without encountering any resistance. Castro, situated on a mountain, was a splendidly built city surrounded by flowery meadows, delightful orchards, and magnificent fountains. The sea in front of the city had a daily tide of 14 feet. Brewer also burned a Spanish ship, set some houses on fire, and took 3 Spanish prisoners on Las Bahias, who informed him that the winter season was nearly over but had been unusually mild, as typically severe weather would destroy houses, uproot trees, and split rocks. They also learned that there was a significant amount of gold in Osorno and Valdivia. Valdivia had been abandoned by the Spaniards due to famine, but was now garrisoned by 300 Castilians. It was difficult to approach the Fort Conception, located 1 league west of Valdivia, except in a small boat. There were nearly 2,000 inhabitants in the area. Furthermore, an elderly woman named Lavisa Pizarra from Quintian, one of the islands in the Chilean inland sea, provided information. She stated that 40 years ago, before the Indians took up arms, the Spaniards had settled peacefully in Osorno. At that time, even ordinary planters had at least 300 slaves, each required to produce a certain amount of gold. The Chiloé Islands were divided into over 100 colonies or plantations, with the Chileans serving as true governors under the Castilians. Those who performed well, appointed commanders by the colony's king. The Chinese had rebelled in various places. At the request of the Chileans, Brewer took some of them, along with their wives and children, onto his ship, providing them with arms. They dug up a chest of silver and a brass gun from the earth. Brewer later fell ill and died. His successor, Elias Herkmans, sent the pilot of the Unity and some seamen, accompanied by 2 Chilean chieftains, in a boat to Kel Mapu. However, they were caught in a violent storm and sought refuge on Horse Island. After landing, the pilot ordered 7 seamen to take the boat to a safer harbor. However, strong winds pushed them away from the shore, causing the boat to take in water and sink, resulting in the drowning of all on board. The stranded group on Horse Island had no provisions or shelter and believed they faced certain death until they discovered a small hut, found 6 sheep and a good quantity of potato roots, which served as their sustenance. When their newfound supplies were almost depleted, they were luckily rescued by the boat belonging to the ship Amsterdam. The entire fleet then anchored before Valdivia. Valdivia, built by the Castilians, previously consisted of 550 impressive houses and was laid out with streets, crossroads, 2 large markets, and 2 magnificent churches. The oppressed Chileans had revolted, killing all the Spanish garrison. In the year 1643, the Chileses, who were oppressively ruled by the Spanish garrison, revolted and subjected the governor to unspeakable atrocities. They poured melted gold into his mouth and ears, made a drinking cup from his skull, and fashioned trumpets from his skull, and fashioned trumpets from his shin bone. The city of Valdivia began to decline, with only a significant portion of the wall remaining intact. Thousands of Chileses flocked to the city, some on horseback and others on foot, all armed with 1-foot-long lances. Herkman, the successor of Brewer, communicated to them through an interpreter that they were mortal enemies of the Spaniards and proposed joining forces with the Chileans against their common foe. He requested permission to build a fort in Valdivia's marketplace as a defense against invasions and sought provisions for the fleet. The Chileans granted these requests and brought in a supply of sheep, hogs, and cattle. However, as soon as Herkman mentioned gold, they became uneasy and claimed ignorance of any gold mines. The mere mention of gold horrified them, as the Spaniards had inflicted terrible atrocities upon their ancestors. As a result, the Chileans grew increasingly distant and did not support construction of the fort. The longer the fleet stayed, the fewer provisions the Chileans brought on board. Consequently, the ships, without any notable achievements, were compelled to set sail and return to Recife. This will conclude Book 1, Americas, An Explorer's Heaven. It has been a treat and an honor to be able to spare some knowledge of some of the histories this world has to offer. So as we search and dig for gems of history, I hope to be able to offer you more knowledge in the near future. So thank you for lending me your ears, and stay tuned for Book 2, Americas, An Explorer's Heaven.